When a company is as big and famous as Disney, it's only natural that they're going to face some criticism. It's pretty much inevitable. But while some of that criticism has most definitely been warranted, particularly during their dark periods, others have been more baffling. With one in particular being that they sanitize their movies too much and make them too kid-friendly. And today, I'd like to address this particular criticism surrounding the company, mainly in regards to some of their more controversial outings, and argue why, if anything, Disney doesn't consider children enough anymore. And needless to say, there will be spoilers for anything and everything in the Disney animated canon ahead, and that's no exaggeration either. Anything in the canon is fair game here. So in case there's any specific movie of theirs you don't want ruined, you might just want to keep on the lookout. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so to get right into the meat of the conversation, some of the more extreme examples of Disney facing criticism for being too sanitized or kid-friendly is Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and to a lesser extent The Princess and the Frog. And to go in reverse, some feel that The Princess and the Frog glosses over the prejudice Tiana has to endure as a result of being a black woman in 1920s Louisiana, and that the film would have been better if that had been the main focus. And similarly, many famously think that The Hunchback of Notre Dame was made too kid-friendly, especially with the inclusion of the gargoyles, to really capture the dark nature of its story. And that's not even getting into how much it downplays Victor Hugo's original novel, as among other things, almost everybody dies, including Esmeralda, Quasimodo, Copland, and Frollo, and Phoebus is anything but a chivalrous knight and is instead a huge womanizer and jerk who doesn't even bother to save Esmeralda from death despite easily being able to prove her innocence. So apart from the characters and setting, the two are basically completely different stories. And of course, there's Pocahontas, which was hit with this especially hard since it was based off real events, and heavily downplayed those events and the consequences that came with them. So in all three of these cases, people argue that things should have been made darker or closer to the book or events that inspired their creation. And that's all well and good, but here's the thing. Disney has always done that. From the very beginning, they have always downplayed, sanitized, and made their stories their films were based on more kid-friendly. Look at any movie they've released, and you will see glaring evidence of that. And just to reinforce that point, let's quickly go over some examples. Like their very first film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Because among other things, in the source material, Snow White didn't have cute little animals to keep her company. The queen tries to kill her 3 times, one of which involves a corset choking her, and the queen gets her comeuppance when iron-hot shoes are placed on her feet and she's forced to dance in them until she dies. Now, while some of these changes were made due to the Hays Code or time constraints, the point still remains that they heavily downplayed the darker aspects of the story and added plenty of cuter and funnier ones in their place. And it just continues down the line. Because if you think Pinocchio was bad, the original book was even worse. Just to name a few things, Pinocchio is a huge jerk that gets several people in trouble without showing any regret, is both hanged and actually turned completely into a donkey, and the fox and cat end up losing their tail and going blind respectively. And also, there's no Jiminy Cricket to represent his conscience either, as he simply squashes the cricket to death when it tries to help him. Or in Bambi, his romance with Faline is portrayed much more realistically in the book, with him having a strong urge to be near her for a few weeks before wanting her to go away again, and then the next spring she gives birth to his children, as is how deers actually mate in nature. And needless to say, things weren't nearly as cute either, with Thumper being just one character that was added to the Disney version. But he also went on to steal the entire movie, which should really say something. Or in Cinderella, there were no talking mice or other animals in the book, and depending on the version you read, there was also mutilation involved. Now, I already spoke at length about how Walt Disney sugarcoated the darker aspects of this movie and why it was necessary in another video, which you can find a link in the description to. So all I'll say is, this is a movie that's only a classic among children because of the changes made to it. Or even in The Sword and the Stone, do you really believe the early years of King Arthur from the famous legend are anything like this? Frankly, it would be easier to list the things Disney didn't change or sanitize here. And in The Jungle Book, the original novel is a rather serious story that involves Shere Khan having both a limp due to being shot and dying at the end, as well as Mowgli coming to realize that he needs to live among humans for his own good, and just generally portraying the jungle in a dangerous and realistic light. So needless to say, Baloo is not a laid-back, fun-loving bear, but is instead very stern and serious, and there is no King Louie or Elephant Patrol. But Walt Disney even point-blank said he didn't want the movie based off the book and went out of his way to make it more fun. And considering it's gone on to become one of its most beloved adaptations, despite barely resembling the book, he obviously knew what he was talking about. But this also continued well after Walt Disney had died, and for a few more examples of that, in the original books that The Rescuers and The Rescuers Down Under were based on, the Bernard character admits that he loves Bianca, but knows that he can never marry her due to their class differences. Now, what does Bernard spend the entire sequel trying to find the perfect moment to do? And what does she say when that moment finally comes? And that's only one such deviation they made from those books. Or The Fox and the Hound, which is a book about how such animals rely on their sense of smell like we humans rely on eyesight, as well as such things as Chief, who in the book is very young and a new recruit, ending up dead as a result of the fox losing 2 families and dying of exhaustion after being chased for so long, and the Hound being shot by his owner after he goes to live in an old folks' home and is told that no pets are allowed. Yeah, it's a very far cry from the story of animals forming such a strong friendship that it ends up overriding their species' natural animosity, as well as a tale on the pointlessness of revenge. Even The Black Cauldron, which was considered very dark by Disney standards at the time, was so heavily sanitized from the original book series it was based on that the author himself viewed it as something completely different from what he wrote. And in that case, it wasn't the fact that it was sanitized, but that it was so dark, as well as not the best written overall, that caused it to flop. And then there's The Little Mermaid, because in Hans Christian Andersen's original story, the mermaid desperately wants to become human because mermaids don't have a soul and cease to exist upon death, so she cuts out her tongue to turn into a human, but only temporarily, as if she can't get the prince she's fallen for to fall in love with her, she'll die. Oh, and despite getting legs, they are extremely painful for her to walk on, and in the end, her efforts are fruitless, as the prince marries somebody else. And when offered the chance to become a mermaid again if she kills the prince, the mermaid instead kills herself. The story was so depressing, in fact, that Andersen actually rewrote the ending so that the mermaid is granted a soul for her sacrifice and might be able to move on one day because even he found it too sad. And needless to say, all of this was nixed in the Disney version, which tells a much more fun, upbeat version of the story instead. And considering it now stands as a Disney classic and was the film that arguably saved the company, most agree that it was definitely for the best, up to and including the Queen of Denmark. Seriously, knowing how the original story goes, suddenly Ursula's death scene doesn't seem so bad, huh? But to give a particularly good example that sums all of this up in a nutshell, let's take a look at one of Disney's lesser-known films, Fun and Fancy-Free, and specifically the Bongo segment. Because to keep it short, that segment is about a circus bear that's beloved by audiences but abused by his trainers. So longing for freedom and wanting to live among his own kind, he escapes into the wilderness. However, he quickly finds that nature isn't as nice or pleasant as he thought it would be, at least until he meets a beautiful lady bear named Lulu Bell that he immediately falls in love with. And after finding out that she returns his feelings but is being pursued by the infamously dangerous and feral Lumpjaw, Bongo uses his circus skills to fight the ferocious bear off and lives happily ever after. Now, considering how obscure this particular movie is, what people are even less likely to know is that this segment was actually based on a short story called Little Bear Bongo, and needless to say, things don't play out exactly as they do in the Disney version, with perhaps most notably the difference being that the equivalent character of Lula Bell in the book mates with another bear and isn't interested in Bongo at all. In fact, he's rejected by the entire bear community for being a weird outsider. It's only after he returns to the circus at the end does he find a female bear who returns his feelings and lives happily ever after with her instead. In other words, the original short story is a rather realistic look of what would happen if a domesticated animal entered the wild. Specifically, that it would be a disaster and they would never find acceptance among their own kind. The Disney version, however, offers a much more ideal version of this scenario where he's able to gain his fellow bear's respect by defeating Lumpjaw, who's not in the book, and doesn't have to go back to the circus to find the happiness he'd longed for. And even then, the fact that Lulu Bell falls for him even before he saves her from Lumpjaw just screams of Disney sanitation, as there's really no reason for it other than because Bongo deserved it after everything he'd been through. Now, which story is objectively better isn't relevant here, as the point is simply that the Disney version forgoes the more realistic approach of the book in order to tell a more uplifting, idealized, and kid-friendly version of the same story. And even the other segment of Fun and Fancy Free, that being Mickey and the Beanstalk, also does this as well, if to a lesser extent, because everybody knows about the infamous debate of whether or not Jack is actually the hero of Jack and the Beanstalk. But here, Walt Disney makes sure to remove any doubt from the viewer's mind, because unlike the original, where Jack not only returns to the castle multiple times to steal various items from the giant, with the harp that plays itself in particular not wanting to be stolen, here the circumstances are completely different. In the Disney version, the land is a happy and prosperous place until their magic harp is stolen, which causes the kingdom to fall into ruin, poverty, and extreme famine. But after obtaining the magic beans and finding a castle in the sky, Mickey, Donald, and Goofy discover that the harp had been stolen by Willie the Giant, and thus become determined to rescue her in order to bring their land back to prosperity. So as a result, not only is Mickey and company unambiguously the heroes of this story, but are absolutely justified in wanting to steal the harp, as not only is it rightfully theirs, but she actively wants to be rescued by them at that. And to take this a step further, the giant in the original tale is a very imposing, scary, and dangerous figure. But here, Willie the Giant is much more comical, being portrayed as little more than a dim-witted buffoon, if one that can still be pretty scary when he gets mad. In other words, Mickey and the Beanstalk takes everything about its source material and removes the scares and moral ambiguity from it, making it about as kid-friendly as it can possibly be. So hopefully all of these examples I've just went over have been more than enough to make my point here, that Disney movies have always toned down their source material and made it more kid-friendly. They did it since their very first movie and have been doing so completely unapologetically ever since. There's a reason Disneyification is an actual term people use, because that's how synonymous with the company it is. It's basically a requirement for any source material they adapt. It's just what they do. So the fact that those aforementioned movies faced criticism for doing just that is frankly ridiculous. I mean, it's Disney. What do you expect them to do? The Princess and the Frog in particular is no different from any other example I went over. Now, to be completely fair here, that criticism was to a much lesser extent, but it's still something worth mentioning. Because one can argue that maybe it shouldn't have addressed the subject at all, or that if Disney was going to broach the issue, it should have been in something less kid-friendly, or that they should have picked a different story for their first Black Princess altogether. And if you believe any of that, that's perfectly okay. But what you can't do is get mad at Disney for doing what they've always done. And the same also applies to Pocahontas. Because I'm just going to come out and say it. This is Disney we're talking about. Did you seriously think that they were going to depict mass murder, violent bloodshed, and main characters completely blinded by bigotry? No, they did what they always did. Sanitized it, made it more ideal, and very kid-friendly. Now, to be fair here, where a legitimate argument can be made is that Disney shouldn't have even attempted to adapt the story of Pocahontas in the first place. Because as I already explained in another video, which you can also find a link in the description too, Pocahontas was basically doomed to fail from the start because the premise alone was going to make a lot of people angry. And then add in the fact that it wasn't even written the best on top of that, and the results are easily one of their most controversial films. Because while one can't necessarily fault Disney for doing what they always did, they can fault them for picking such a touchy subject to sanitize and make kid-friendly. To put it simply, they shouldn't have even attempted to put a Disney-fied spin on something like that, and that's something people can legitimately criticize them for. But just the fact that they sanitized the story of Pocahontas in isolation is not, because anybody who knows anything about Disney should have been able to see that coming a mile away. Again, the problem lies in the fact that they decided to do it in the first place, and not the inevitable execution of that idea. And similarly, one can also argue that The Hunchback of Notre Dame wasn't exactly the best thing to adapt into a Disney movie, and therefore sanitize and make kid-friendly either, especially because unlike Pocahontas, this film does actually contain quite a lot of the novel's darker elements in its undertones, but whether or not that's a good thing has been heavily debated since its release, as some feel that its darker nature is what makes it one of the best movies Disney ever made, while others feel that its mix of darker tones with typical Disney ones is too jarring. And again, that in and of itself is a fair criticism, but the fact still remains that since Disney decided to adapt the book, the fact that it's way lighter and more kid-friendly was inevitable. The inclusion of things like the gargoyles was basically a given, because again, adding such comic relief characters was something Disney had already done countless times before. Now again, there are people who argued that the movie would have been better if Disney had embraced its darker tones, and while that may be true, the point is that this is Disney we're talking about. Maybe they never should have adapted such a dark novel into a movie, but the fact that they did made the final product a foregone conclusion, and anybody who was expecting otherwise simply doesn't know Disney. Now, as I already noted, I'm not trying to say here that these movies are masterpieces and that anybody who doesn't like that these stories were sanitized should just suck it up. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying is that Disney making their stories very idealized and kid-friendly is something that they've always done, and that it's not exclusive to the movies that faced criticism for doing it. As well as that the criticism for the movies in question, but especially the likes of Pocahontas and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, should be directed more at the fact that they even attempted to adapt them in the first place rather than that they sanitized the final product. Because let's face it, not every story can, or even should be, a Disney story. Some stories are just meant to be dark, gritty, and realistic, and Disney should stay far away from things like that, because idealizing such stories wouldn't just feel right. But the point here is, Disney has always sanitized their stories for both good and bad, and that very sanitation is what ends up defining the final product. Because when done right, it can lead to classics like Snow White, Pinocchio, or The Little Mermaid. But when they pick the wrong stories to adapt, it can lead to much more controversial outings like Pocahontas or The Hunchback of Notre Dame. But, and I can't stress this point enough, the common denominator here is that all of these stories, and many others as well, were heavily sanitized from their original versions and made to be very kid-friendly. That is the one consistent thing that Disney has always done. Or at least, that's what they always used to do, anyway. Because I've brought this up many times before, but since the mid-2010s, Disney has been doing things much more in line with how Pixar tells their stories rather than how they used to do it. And since Pixar's style is pretty much the exact opposite of Disney, with their goal being to tell stories as intricately and realistically as possible, one can't help but feel that Disney has abandoned a lot of their core principles in favor of being more like Pixar. Because while on paper their movies are still made for children, one can't help but feel that they aren't really sanitized that much anymore and seem to go out of their way to teach some life-changing lesson. And while none of that is bad on its own, and has led to some pretty good movies, it doesn't really feel like Disney anymore. Because making movies fun and simple was Walt Disney's entire philosophy. I even dedicated an entire video to comparing his style to modern day Disney in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to. And in it I make much of the fact that he felt the best stories were the ones that were fun first and foremost. For him it wasn't really about a message, but about making people feel emotions, be that laughter or sadness. And above all, he wanted his stories to make people happy. That's why his stories were always sanitized and about as feel-good as a movie could possibly get. Because he believed in the good things that life had to offer and wasn't ashamed to let people indulge in unabashed wholesomeness for a little while. Because ultimately, letting people, and especially children, experience the impossible wonders that animation could bring them was more important than anything else. And it's that above all else that Disney has lost since they acquired Pixar. They want so desperately to be taken as seriously as them that they tell their stories the exact same way they do. But it never feels right because it's simply not Disney. That's why Wish in particular failed, because it was an attempt by people who don't understand Disney to make an old school Disney movie. And the results were this synthetic mess of Disney and Pixar's ideas rolled into one. Because not only is the movie not based off any existing story, but it bashes the moral that you have to make your wishes come true over the head until it's a bloody stump, as if it's saying that the song that represents the whole company is wrong. But the thing is, even Walt Disney believed that. He believed that you had to work hard to make your dreams come true, and that simply wishing for them wouldn't do much good, probably more so than most others, because that's exactly how he achieved his dreams, by working for them. But instead of repeatedly smashing that over people's heads, he portrayed it much more subtly and trusted his audience to be able to figure it out on their own. It's even point-blank stated that Geppetto's wish came true only because he brought happiness to others. So even he, the real subject of that song, had to work for his wish even if he didn't know it. And believing in that wish was simply the last step in making it come true. And even in isolation, that's exactly what the song is saying. It's not telling people to just sit around and wait for everything you want to be handed to you on a silver platter. Instead, it's saying that you have to truly believe in your dream. And if you work hard enough for it because of that belief, it will come true. And that's not even getting into the likes of how Valentino was meant to be a callback to classic Disney comic relief characters. Because Disney always made sure their best comic relief characters had heart in addition to their laughs, while Valentino is just a gag character and nothing more. But the point here is, it's like Disney has grown up and lost the innocence and wholesomeness that used to define them so strongly, and that's honestly a problem. Because people, and especially children, need things like Disney movies every once in a while. Just as every story can't be Disney, not every story can be dark, gritty, or depressing either. There is a time and place for shameless wholesomeness and idealism, and Disney used to have that down to a science, but now they seem almost ashamed of it. And as I just said, that's a problem, especially because there is a decided lack of such ideal, feel-good films nowadays. To put it another way, Disney needs to stop denying aspects of their legacy that people love and embrace them instead. Disney simply needs to be Disney again, and embracing that old sanitation and wholesomeness would be a very good place to start, because that's honestly what the company was founded on and was known for generations. And if they continue to shun that, might just be what destroys them in due time. Okay, I think I've definitely made my point. And if you're still here, thank you for sticking it out and listening to what I had to say. But now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Do you believe that Disney sanitizing their stories is not only something that has always been a thing, but what made the company so special in years past, and that their lack of it following their acquisition of Pixar has been to their detriment? Or do you believe their wholesome nature made their movies too saccharine, especially when it wasn't appropriate, and are better off not embracing it as much? Please let me know in the comments below. And as always, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video just because you watched it. You can feel about Disney and the way they made their movies however you'd like, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is totally fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all very, very appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.